Okay, just wanted to be mamshich a little bit with the avodah of Yom Kippur, although, we're not near Yom Kippur right now, but it was the partial last week. That is, we were discussing the great mystery of what the Torah calls the So'ir Lazazel, which literally means the goat that goes to the desert demons, and Chazal renamed it to be less theologically problematical to So'ir HaMishtaleach. That simply means the goat that is sent away. And basically, this is the goat upon which the Kohen Gadol confesses the sins of the Jewish people. And then what happens is that the goat is thrown over the cliff. And when the goat dies, that is considered to be a kapara for all of Yisrael. And the question is, what exactly is going on here? Certainly it would not be appropriate to bring korbanos, to bring a korban to a demon and the like. So I mentioned that the Ramban introduced the concept of what is called a shochad l'satan, a bribe to the satan, so that the satan will not prosecute, so to speak, like giving meat, raw meat, to the wild dogs to give you access to the king. And at the end, I brought in Rav Dessler to explain that this is a mechanism for the concept of tshuva, that we have to make concessions sometimes to the Yetzer Hara in order that it shouldn't attack us with great ferocity. That's kind of the bribe to the Satan, such as basically saying, I'm not going to speak Lashon Hara for a half an hour, afterwards I will, and that kind of puts the Satan off guard, and as a result you're able to accomplish the progress that you need to make. That's Rav Dessler's psychological explanation of the Ramban's mystical idea called a Sheikhad l'Satan. But now I just want to mention some other thoughts, and that is, you'll recall that the So'ir HaMishtaleach is chosen by a lottery in which you have to have two goats that are exactly the same. They look the same, and the Kohen has a basket that has two markers, one that says for Hashem and one says for Lazazel. He puts his hands in without looking, and he then puts them down, and one is Lashem and one is Lazazel. So Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch has a very, very interesting observation about the two goats. Let's imagine that a goat had consciousness. Let's imagine a goat could see what's going on. So here you have two goats. They're exactly the same. Their life has been identical until this point. And one goat, the goat that is going for a nice walk for around 10 miles, looks at the goat that was chosen Lashem and sees a goat whose neck is slit, whose throat is slit, who's immediately killed, as opposed to this goat going out for a nice walk, being able to eat from the grass as it's going along. So in the mind of the goat, so to speak, Rav Hirsch says, the one that goes Lashem is suffering so much, has so many inconveniences, doesn't really enjoy life, just dies. But I, who go on the path of evil, have joy and freedom and pleasure and opportunity. So Rav Hirsch says the whole exercise of So'ir HaMishtaleach is designed to impress upon us the illusion that people have when they reject the way of God. We think, a person might think, if I reject the way of Hashem, I then have a life of joy and a life of simcha and a life of freedom. Because initially, the So'ir HaMishtaleach is having a really good time. It, goes for a long walk, it eats the grass, it can do whatever it wants. It's walking around, it has no restrictions, no limitations. But it ends with dying for the demons. It ends with death and destruction and distance from God. As opposed to the So'ir Lashem, whose throat is slit, and at least initially it looks like it's going through a difficult time, but its blood enters the Holy of Holies, and it's elevated and consecrated. Which means the purpose of the ceremony, Rav Hirsch says, is to make us realize that we often mistake what is true happiness and what is true freedom for the illusions of following our Yetzer Hara. And that's why it is such a great atonement, it is such a great kapara, because it causes us to meditate on the notion that what looks like the short-term pathway to happiness is actually the road to destruction. And what looks like deprivation and sacrifice and difficulty is actually the road to redemption and joy. That's the notion of the of the two goats. Now, the final point I wanted to bring out is, what is the significance that the two goats have to be exactly the same? So, why is that important? Why can't I take a black goat and a white goat? The Torah is very makpid. They be essentially twins, look the same, right? Same age. So here, you really see a very important idea. We look at the Soyer HaMishtaleach as the bad goat, the goat of sin. And we look at the Soyer Lashem as the good goat, the goat of holiness. But the point that we're making is, there's really no difference between the bad goat and the good goat. Meaning, you're not bad because you were born bad, and you're not good because you were born good. Really, because of the koach of Bechira, the biggest Russia can become the biggest tzaddik, and the biggest tzaddik can become the biggest Russia. The identity of the goats highlights that one should not make the mistake that if I am a Russia, it's because of some defect inherently in my character. Or if someone else is a tzaddik, it is because they were born a tzaddik. No, the good goat and the bad goat are exactly the same. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu put everybody in the world with the equal opportunity to become righteous or to become evil. That itself is a very important lesson on Yom Kippur. Because on Yom Kippur, a person might despair of themselves. A person might say, I'm too far gone to ever be able to change. But the two goats remind you that you're no different than a tzaddik. A tzaddik and you have the same DNA, have the same neshama, have the same personality, have the same kochos. And therefore there is always the capacity of bechira to be able to define your life. But one other point I think is especially telling. The goats themselves are not making the choice. In other words, it's not like the good goat doesn't choose to be good and the bad goat doesn't choose to be bad. The choice is made by somebody else, the Kohen Gadol, through the lottery. And that reminds you of another pedagogical point, very important in teaching Talmidim and very important in raising children. And that is, remember the destructive, self-fulfilling prophecy of labeling. Meaning the bad goat becomes bad, meaning the path of destruction, because it is labeled as the bad goat. The good goat becomes good because it is labeled as the good goat. Meaning intrinsically the good goat and the bad goat are exactly the same. So that reminds us that when we put labels on people, that labeling tends to become the reality of their lives, even if our labeling was not right. So, if you convey to your child or to your students, your Talmud, that they are worthy, that they are good, that they have potential, then it's likely that that potential is going to be realized to some degree or another. If, on the other hand, the labeling is you're no good, you're worthless, you're not able to accomplish anything, then that person will justify the prediction that was placed upon them. So the Soyer Mishtaleach, on one hand, highlights the power of Bechira because the goats are the same, so you can always make a choice, but it also highlights the idea that negative labeling could destroy. I mean, I still remember, although I don't think this had any drastic repercussions, but it struck me as a little kid that I remember, I think it was in 4th grade or something. So on the first day of school, the teacher, this was the English teacher, is going through the class roster, and she says to one of the kids, one of my friends, she says, "Oh, I had your brother 2 years ago. He was really bad. I'm assuming, you're going to be the same behavior problem." So I was thinking to myself, hey, that's not fair. I mean, look, he's being labeled ahead of time. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, I don't think this was catastrophic. I think the kid turned out okay, as far as I remember. But it's an interesting point that, you judge a kid the first day of school before you even know him. You're going to be a problem. Well, those things tend to be self-fulfilling prophecies. And that's another lesson in the Soyer Mishtaleach. Don't label negatively. Don't put negative labels on people. Respect their potential and build them up and show them that they have the koach to achieve great things. The Gemara in Bava Metzia says a remarkable story that at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, this is after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, so obviously many Jews were killed, and many kids were left orphans. Jewish children were left orphans. They had to fend for themselves. They had to take care for themselves. You don't even have a sense of how chaotic it is. In fact, it is actually very interesting how reticent Chazal are about describing those bad times. I mean, Chazal describe, episodically, the Churban Beis HaMikdash and the like. But all of those years of following Bar Kokhba, Chazal say very little. In fact, Chazal say very little about the Bar Kokhba revolt, even to begin with. But you have to understand the massive dislocations, how many people were murdered, much more than the Churban Beis HaMikdash, how many children were left in the streets and the like. So at some point the Gemara tells us that Rav Yehuda Hanasi wanted to know if Rabbi Eliezer Rav Yaisi, who was a great Tana who died, if he had any living children that could be salvaged, that could be reclaimed. And they told him, yeah, he has a son who is wandering the streets as a male prostitute, meaning the only way he could make a living would be he'd hire himself out that way, as a prostitute, to Romans, to Jews, to Goyim, who knows what he was doing. So Rav Yehuda Hanasi somehow retrieved him. He brought him in. He gave him a home. He gave him lodging. Rav Yehuda Hanasi happened to be actually very wealthy. And he then made him, it says, now it's not clear if this is meant to be 100% literally, he made him a Rosh Yeshiva. He gave him a shir. I don't know how old the kid was, maybe he was 18 already. And the kid said, what do you mean, how can I give a shir? I mean, I'm a prostitute. He says, well, now that you're giving a shir, you really can't do this anymore. It doesn't look very good. And it mentions that every few days he had a strong desire to go back to the street, to go back to where he had gotten used to that type of life. And Rav Yehuda Hanasi said, what are people going to say? A great Torah scholar does such things. You can't do that. And kind of la'at, by building him up and by telling him, you're a great Talmid Chacham. How could you go back to the streets? That became the reality. He became a great Talmid Chacham because somebody believed in him. Rav Yehuda Hanasi believed in him, and that made him who he was. We find the same thing with the story of Rabbi Akiva. And this is going to be very relevant to Sfiras HaOmer. I mentioned Friday night on the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, which is the second of the parshas, the great pasuk, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your friend like you love yourself. So Rabbi Akiva declared, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is a fundamental principle in the Torah, all important principle in the Torah. So the Chassam Sofer says, he offers a very beautiful interpretation. He says that Rabbi Akiva is speaking autobiographically. Rabbi Akiva is referring to his own life. The story of Rabbi Akiva, which the Gemara tells us in Maseches Nedarim, Rabbi Akiva was 40 years old, and he was a shepherd, and he was in the employ of a very wealthy landowner in Yerushalayim, who went by the nickname, this wasn't his actual name, Kalba Savua. Kalba Savua is Aramaic for a stuffed dog, a dog that was full. Why was he called a dog that was satiated? A dog that was full. So it mentions that he was so hospitable that anyone who entered his house hungry left like a dog that was full. Those of you that have dogs know that dogs never get full. So basically that means it's like a hyperbole. He gave you so much food that even a dog would be stuffed when a dog left. So he was very hospitable, and he was very wealthy, and he employed many people. And one of the people he employed was Akiva ben Yosef. He wasn't Rabbi Akiva, who was ignorant. He didn't know how to read. And Akiva was a shepherd. And it mentions that the boss's daughter, Kalba Savua's daughter, whose name was Rachel, was attracted to him, fell in love with him, saw kochos in him, saw greatness in him, and she wanted to marry him. And they agreed to get married. Kalba Savua was so angry. Kalba Savua said that We're like the most prestigious family in Yerushalayim, and you're going to an Am Haaretz. And Ad Kedei Kach, he was so against the marriage that he made a vow that she would have no benefit from his property, meaning he disinherited her, and he made a netter that she would get nothing from him whatsoever. So she married Rabbi Akiva. They lived in poverty, and as you know, she sent Rabbi Akiva to Yerushalayim to learn Torah. And he went to Yerushalayim to learn Torah. His rebbes were Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. And he started with first graders. He didn't know how to read. So he's 40 years old. He's sitting with little kids, learning how to read. He stays there for 12 years, right? And after the 12 years, he comes to pay his wife a visit. And without even seeing her, he overhears her talking to a neighbor, where a certain neighbor says to her, "What type of husband do you have who leaves you for 12 years? And the wife said, "I wouldn't mind if you go away for another 12 years to learn Torah." And Rabbi Akiva turned around right away, and he went back for another 12 years. You know, everybody always asks the kasha, it's not as a digression, why couldn't he at least say hello? Why couldn't he say hello, have a cup of coffee? What, he turns around without even talking to her, like what's going on? So they give two terutzim for this kasha. And again, both of these are not on our madrega. I mean, this was a different madrega. Answer number one is, this is what they say b'shem Rav Aaron Kotler, that 1 times 24 is not the same as 2 times 12, meaning he didn't want to break, if she gave him permission, he didn't want to break the momentum with a ben asmanim, so to speak, because if it would have been 2 periods of 12 broken up with a break in the middle, it wouldn't have been the same as a continuity of 24 years. And therefore he wanted to keep the momentum if he was given permission, if she said it was okay with her. Otherwise he would have stayed. Now, that's what the Chazon Ish said. The Chazon Ish gave a very interesting mashal. Let's imagine it takes 45 minutes for a big pot of water to come to a boil. 45 minutes. And let's imagine you shut off the gas every 43 minutes. So 43 minutes, it's not boiling, shut it off, cools down, 43, 43, 43, 43. You can do 43 minutes 100 times, and you'll never get it to boil. You need a retzef, you need a continuity of 45 minutes. The Chazon Ish said, learning an hour and then another hour later is not the same as learning 2 hours. There's a certain cumulative effect that you get. And Rav Aaron Kotler said that was the story of Rabbi Akiva. He wanted a 24-year learning and not like a 12 and a 12. That's answer number one. Again, I say this is not for our madrega because if somebody were to ask today, I want to leave my wife for 12 years, the psak would be absolutely usher. This was something she wanted, and he knew this was something she wanted, and therefore he was not putting his needs above her, the other way around. She was the one that sent him. Now that's answer number one. Answer number two, which I actually like because it's a kind of an emotional answer, is he couldn't allow himself to say hello to her, because if he would have said hello to her, he wouldn't have been able to go back. It's like he didn't allow himself to feel the pain of the separation, because on one hand, he had a job to do. On the other hand, it would have been overwhelming to leave his wife again, so he didn't allow himself to do it. Yeah.
I don't understand how the first answer works when he's already left. He's already broken.
Well, he did break it in the sense that there was travel. Although the interesting thing is, how far was he? I mean, he probably was not that far from Yerushalayim anyway. But still, there is a difference. Meaning to say, he's not yet in schmoozing modality. He's not yet in, you know what I'm saying. In other words, it's not the same as absolute continuity, but it's much more continuous than had he actually settled himself in that situation. But yeah, this is something you think about, in our own learning, the notion of continuity. But the second pshat, I think, is very moving, that Rabbi Akiva too had this tremendous feeling of longing to be with his spouse, but he knew that his job was not. Now, after the 24 years, he comes back as the greatest rabbi in Israel, and he has 24,000 students. 24,000 students. Can you imagine that? Either Mir or Lakewood, it's a machlokas about numbers, is the largest yeshiva in the world. Let's say Mir. Mir is the largest yeshiva in the world. In fact, they tell a story that a person was wandering around the Beis Israel neighborhood looking for the Mir yeshiva, and he happened to bump into one of the Brisker Rosh Yeshivas. He didn't know and he asked the Brisker Rosh Yeshiva, like, where is the Mir yeshiva? So the Rosh Yeshiva said to him, just stand still, it'll come to you. They're always doing new buildings. He says, you can stay here, it'll come to you eventually. So Mir is a gigantic yeshiva. So how big is Mir? Mir is 7,000, maybe 8,000. All the great yeshivas in Europe, by the way, were a lot smaller than that. Volozhin, at its height, 400. Slobodka, 300. They were not thousands of people. Mir and Lakewood are gigantic yeshivas. So, what's a gigantic yeshiva? 8,000 people. Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 Talmidim. We'll come back to what happened to them. So what happens? He comes back with a huge crowd of 24,000 Talmidim. And this woman who has been living in abject poverty all of these years, dressed in rags, comes to see him. And they think she's a crazy woman, whoever it is. They push her away. And Rabbi Akiva says the words that you will actually see on his kever in Tiberia. He says, Shali v'shalachem, all that I've done and all that you've accomplished, Shalah, is all because of her. And there's an interesting second part of the story, that Kalba Savua, after so many years, after 24 years, finally regretted what he did to his daughter. He regretted it. He didn't. He says he saw what she was suffering so much. But he made a neder. So how do you get rid of a neder? You have to have hataras nedarim. You have to go in front of either a beis din, which is what we do today, or me'ikar din. We don't practice this today. You can go before a yachid mumcha, an extraordinary individual who is expert in, again, our minhag is not to be somech on that, but you have to go to a very, very great posek who theoretically can annul your neder. Now, when you go in front of a beis din, or in front of a yachid mumcha. So in order to matter a neder, technically what you're supposed to say is, if I would have known a certain thing, I wouldn't have made the vow. Meaning I didn't know a certain thing, and I made the vow under a mistake, right? So for example, let's say you made a neder not to have chocolate, okay? You made a neder, not that you should make a neder, but like that, but you made such a neder. And then when you get home, you see your wife made a chocolate pie or whatever it would be, a chocolate cake. So you run to the nearest beis din and you say, if I would have known that my wife was going to make a chocolate cake before I made the vow, I never would have made the vow. That's called a pesach, an opening. And if the beis din is convinced of your sincerity, they matter. So Kalba Savua wants to annul his vow. And he hears that this great rabbi has come in town, Rabbi Akiva. He doesn't know it's his son-in-law. And he says, I'll go to this great rabbi and I will annul the vow. And he goes to Rabbi Akiva and he says, I made this vow that all of my property is forbidden to my daughter, but I regret it. And I'd like to be released from the vow. So Rabbi Akiva asked him a question. If you would have known that your son-in-law would be a Talmid Chacham, would you have made the vow? In other words, that's the Pesach. And Kalba Savua answered, a Talmid Chacham, if I would have known he would know how to read, I wouldn't have made the vow. So Rabbi Akiva mattered the vow. He mattered the vow, and then he revealed his identity, etc. And then Rabbi Akiva, indeed, he and his wife became wealthy. They shared in Kalba Savua's wealth and the like. Now, Tosos in Kesuvos asks a very, very interesting question. The Mishnah says in Maseches Nedarim, Ein poschin binolad. You cannot use a future event as a Pesach. Now, let's think about the sense of this. The yesod of a Pesach is my neder was made under a mistake. So in the example I gave you before, my wife already made the chocolate cake when I made the vow, but I didn't know that. So that's a Pesach. If I would have known my wife already went to the trouble, even though it's trivial, but that is a Pesach. If I already would have known that my wife had gone to the trouble of making a chocolate cake, I wouldn't have made the vow. The vow was made under a mistake. But let's assume that you make the vow and you didn't tell your wife, and a week later your wife makes a chocolate cake. And you say, oy vey, and you go to the Beis Din and you say, if I would have known my wife would make a chocolate cake, I wouldn't have made the vow. That may not be a Pesach. And the reason is because there was no mistake at the time of your vow. This is a future event, meaning at the time of your vow, there was no circumstance of which you were ignorant. That is what is called a nolad. A nolad is a future event that occurs. Now, let's apply this to the Rabbi Akiva situation. If Rabbi Akiva had been a learned person, but Kalba Savua thought he was ignorant, like Rabbi Akiva was a nister, and Kalba Savua made a vow not to give his daughter any money, he could say, oh, I wasn't aware of the circumstances. I didn't know Rabbi Akiva was learned. Had I known he was learned, I wouldn't have made the vow. That would have been a Pesach. But in this case, Rabbi Akiva was ignorant at the time of the vow. There was no mistake. I made a vow because I don't want to give my money. I'm not saying he's justified. Don't confuse that. We're not saying should he have made the vow. All I'm saying is his vow was not a mistaken vow. That's all. Meaning, I don't want to give my money to an ignorant person, so I'm making a vow. Now, he became learned later. So Taisus asked the kasha, how could that be used as a Pesach? You're using a future event to annul a vow. And a future event cannot be used. That's called ein poschen benolad. You don't use a future event as a basis for a Pesach because it has to be what you call a pre-existing condition. And a pre-existing condition is a mistake, and that's a basis for annulment. So Tosfos gives a beautiful, beautiful answer. Tosfos says like this. Rabbi Akiva had already started some learning, some basic learning at the time of the vow. And Tosfos says, it is so clear that if you truly commit yourself to learning, you will become a Talmid Chacham. That the future event is ki'ilu, it already happened. Meaning that's not called a future event because it is so certain based on the sincere desire to grow. Again, that's also a great, great musar. Yeah?
So did Kalba Savua not think that Rabbi Akiva had the potential to learn how to read?
Well, I don't think he felt he didn't have the potential, but he thought he didn't have the interest. And I'll elaborate on this a little bit. Now, the story of Rabbi Akiva, again, I'm sure you're largely familiar with it. And by the way, we'll talk about that later. Those 24,000 students a few years later are the ones who died. So it's an amazing thing. On one hand, the 24,000 students is such a triumph. All those years of sacrifice. She now sees what was accomplished. And a few years later, in the ashes. Again, it's a very, just from a human perspective, it's quite a story. And we'll talk about the deaths of the students later, because I want to go back to the labeling. That's why I'm bringing this in. So, the story of Rabbi Akiva is tremendous, tremendous chizuk for every person. You know, you begin learning late, you come to Torah late. Late could be 20, 22, 25. But whatever it is, for the vast, vast majority, 99.9%, people are here younger than the age of 40. Right? In fact, we have problems if you're that old, dormitory, whatever it is. We're not set up for older people. So a person thinks, how can I ever catch up? How can I ever grow? How can I ever be a Talmid Chacham? Think of Rabbi Akiva. What a story that is. That's someone who didn't even know how to read at all. at age 40, became the great, great person that he became. And Chazal don't give you a lot of romantic stories, so to speak, but they give you this story, because this is such a chizuk to a person, to always recognize that there's potential that can be realized. Now, let me go back to the Chassam Sofer. Rabbi Akiva taught, V'yahavta l'reyacha kamocha. This is a klal gadol b'Torah. Now, we normally translate that to mean it's an important principle in the Torah. That's how we normally translate it. The Chassam Sofer has a bit of a different translation. It's an important principle in how you grow in Torah. Meaning, it's a klal gadol. And that is the following. The Chassam Sofer says, Rabbi Akiva is being autobiographical. The only reason I, Rabbi Akiva, achieved whatever I achieved in Torah is because my wife saw in me kochos, powers, and abilities and talents that I never would have seen in myself. Now that's connected to love, because when you love somebody, you're essentially loving the qualities of goodness that are within them. Right? Right? The person has qualities. It could be kindness, it could be wisdom, whatever it is. I love you because of those qualities. So Rabbi Akiva is saying, the fact that my wife Rachel, that was her name, loved me means she saw the qualities within me. And only because of that did I become great in Torah, Rabbi Akiva said. So this ties in, this was a long digression, so to speak, but this ties in to the Sorah HaMishtaleach in the positive way, right? One of the lessons of the Sorah HaMishtaleach is you label the bad goat as bad, it becomes bad. The story of Rabbi Akiva, you label the person as good, they become good. Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is the great klal in Torah. In other words, how does a person become great in Torah? By someone loving them, but loving them in this sense means seeing their kochos, seeing their potential, seeing their greatness. She saw in Rabbi Akiva something that Rabbi Akiva didn't even realize he had. It's interesting. I mean, again, it's always a little risky to engage in psychoanalysis of people who lived 2,000 years ago, and then certainly people, the Tanoim, who are totally beyond our madrega. But the Gemara describes Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara quotes, not describes, the Gemara quotes Rabbi Akiva as making a statement. When I was an Am Ha'aretz, he said, if I would see a Talmid Chacham, I hated them. I would want to rip them like a fish, tear a fish, or according to one opinion, I would want to bite them, and then he makes the point, and not bite them like a dog, which is just a regular bite, but bite them like a donkey, right? Break the bone. Rabbi Akiva, in other words, expressed that there was a time in his life he had hatred for a Talmid Chacham. Now, he doesn't say why. He just makes the observation that when I saw a Talmid Chacham, I would want to bite them. I'd want to kill them. But I think, again, this is a little speculative psychoanalysis, so to speak, but I think the concept is that you're a Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva must have been a smart guy, naturally. He must have been smart. But he didn't know how to read. He didn't know any Torah. No one ever took the time to teach him, for whatever reason. We don't even know exactly why that was the case. So maybe you've met people like that. You know, there are people in the world who are not educated, who don't get very far. Maybe they're janitors or whatever it would be. But they're very, very bright people who never had an opportunity to develop themselves in any way. So they will usually often feel a lot of resentment towards the intellectual, the aristocracy, so to speak. So Rabbi Akiva felt that way as well. In other words, he was aware of his intellect, but he didn't think there was any way he could possibly direct it to Torah, because he had to work for a living, and he had no one to teach him. What's he supposed to do? But Rachel broke through everything and said, we will live in poverty, and you will go learn. And Rabbi Akiva said it was the faith that she had in me that made me great in Torah. Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Right? Yeah.
What should we do with the opinion that Rabbi Akiva was a Talmud Chacham and then went off the derech and then went back on the derech? That exists, right?
There is such a view. I think that's essentially a minority view. I think the reason why the Gemara never says that. In other words, that's an interpretation. There is no statement in the Gemara to that effect. But some commentaries say that Rabbi Akiva was able to achieve what he achieved only because he did have a background. But I have to tell you, that kind of takes the whole inspiration out of the story. If Rabbi Akiva is simply, he was a Talmud Chacham, went up there and then came back, that's nice, but that's not a chizuk for us. I think the standard Havana, which most do understand it that way, is that Rabbi Akiva started from zero. And therefore the great chizuk is that we can start from zero and still reach very, very high madrigas. Now, I can't make a promise, and Ohr Somayach cannot make a promise that anybody here will be Rabbi Akiva. In fact, I can actually promise you won't, and I won't. Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Akiva. But still, the fact that there is such a model says that there's something we can look up to and give us encouragement as well. Of course, this raises a question. Maybe I'll leave it for next time, because let's talk about the end of the story. The 24,000 students died. And they died in the period between Pesach and Shavuos, and that is why the Omer period, different minhagim, we'll talk about different minhagim, no weddings, no haircuts, etc., because we mourn the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva. But the Gemara in Yevamah says, why did they die? They died of a plague. Okay, that's how they died. But why did Hashem cause them to die? Because they did not show proper kavod for each other. They didn't show proper respect for each other. They didn't honor each other. B'pashtus, kind of a lack of Avas Yisrael and all of those things. So the one big question you could ask is, I understand that you could be nichshol in those averas, but how could the students of Rabbi Akiva be nichshol? Rabbi Akiva was the one who taught the Ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This was his teaching. So how could it be that what was the most precious teaching of Rabbi Akiva is the one the students didn't fulfill, and as a result they died? Right? Isn't it kind of a contradiction? He is the one that says v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Right? So that's a question you can think about. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay.